Somewhere between the evidence and the verdict, that's where we live. Welcome to Enter the Crime. I'm Ava with my colleague Brandon, and we don't stop until we educate, entertain, and excite. Like, share, and subscribe.
Right now, as you listen to this, you are actively shedding microscopic pieces of yourself.
Yeah, literally everywhere.
Right, like every time you pick up a coffee cup or, every time you scratch your arm.
Or even just exhale in a cold room, honestly.
Exactly. You are leaving behind this biological blueprint, a carbon copy of your genetic code. And for decades of modern policing, that invisible trail of biological debris was, it was practically useless to law enforcement.
Unless you were already a convicted criminal, right? Like someone whose DNA was already sitting in a locked government database somewhere.
Right. You could leave your DNA on 100 coffee cups, and the police would simply have no way to connect that biological material back to your specific name.
But today, that has completely changed. Because your third cousin, someone you might not have even spoken to in 20 years, decided to trace their ancestry online.
Yeah, just to find out, what percentage Irish they are.
Exactly. And because of that innocent hobby, your discarded coffee cup could be the exact key a detective uses to build a web around you.
It's wild. The direct linear line between a crime scene and a suspect has basically vanished. We aren't operating in a world of physical fingerprints anymore. We have entered the era of the biological dragnet.
I mean, the transformation in investigative techniques over just the last few years, it really cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
We are looking at an entirely new diagnostic landscape.
Yeah.
It's a world where consumer enthusiasm for tracing family trees has inadvertently constructed the most comprehensive, completely unregulated forensic database in human history.
Which brings us to the topic of today's deep dive. Because it sounds like a plot pulled straight from a dystopian sci-fi novel, but it is actively playing out in courtrooms, police precincts, and state legislatures across the country right at this very second.
We're talking about the revolutionary and highly contested world of investigative genetic genealogy.
Commonly referred to as IGG. And to map out this terrain, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today. We've got these dense legal analyses from the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review.
We also have a very detailed procedural criminal defense breakdown from the TIAC law firm.
Right. Plus investigative journalism pieces from CBS News and the Washington Post. And we are looking directly at the text of groundbreaking legislative summaries of new state laws that are, attempting to rein this all in.
So the mission for today is to break this all down into its operational and legal components. We're going to unpack the exact step-by-step scientific methods law enforcement uses to capture serial criminals by leveraging these consumer genealogy sites.
We'll analyze the underlying biology of why this actually works and, critically examine how this unprecedented technology is really stress testing our Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure.
And finally, we'll explore the intense legal battles brewing right now for criminal defense attorneys, because they have to navigate these new invisible dragnets and figure out how to challenge evidence they might not even know exists.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the legal earthquake of genetic genealogy, we have to start at the epicenter, right?
Yeah, you really can't look at the abstract science or the constitutional law without first looking at the specific catalyst.
The singular cold case that proved just how unprecedented and powerful this tool really is.
The timeline of modern forensic genealogy divides cleanly into two eras, basically. Before the Golden State Killer and after the Golden State Killer.
Wow, yeah. And for those who aren't familiar with the historical footprint of this terror, we are talking about a criminal who operated across California with absolute impunity from 1974 all the way to 1986.
And he wasn't initially known as the Golden State Killer. That moniker came decades later.
Right. He began his criminal career known as the Visalia Ransacker. He was a burglar who broke into over 100 homes in the San Joaquin Valley.
And often just to steal trivial items or rearrange furniture and just terrorize the occupants.
But the pathology escalated. He moved to Northern California, became known as the East Area Rapist, and was responsible for over 50 meticulously planned, brutal sexual assaults.
And then he moved down to Southern California and escalated yet again. He became the original Night Stalker, committing at least 13 horrifying murders.
So why wasn't he caught for decades?
Well, the jurisdictional fragmentation of California law enforcement in the 1970s and 80s was basically his greatest asset.
Like different counties not talking to each other.
Exactly. For over 2 decades, these crimes were investigated as entirely separate series, by completely disjointed local agencies. A detective in Sacramento investigating a string of rapes had no streamlined way to cross-reference their files with a homicide detective in Orange County.
Because the technological infrastructure just didn't exist to bridge the gap between those disparate crime scenes. They were all operating in these distinct fiefdoms.
Right. But that jurisdictional wall finally started to crack in 2001.
Because of traditional DNA profiling, right?
Yeah, it had matured to the point where forensic analysts could finally look at biological evidence left at the Southern California murder scenes and compare it directly to the evidence preserved from the Northern California rapes.
And the analysis came back as a perfect match. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were definitively, biologically, the exact same person.
Which was a massive breakthrough, obviously.
Right.
But it immediately led to an equally massive brick wall.
Because they had pristine, perfectly preserved DNA from the crime scenes. They had the killer's biological signature.
So they took that signature and uploaded it into the FBI's National DNA Database.
Which is known as CODIS, right? The Combined DNA Index System.
Yes. And the expectation was, a criminal this prolific must have been arrested at some point. But the CODIS search yielded absolutely zero matches.
Yeah.
The database was completely blind to him.
And that failure of CODIS is so crucial for understanding why genetic genealogy had to be born in the first place. Because CODIS isn't like a magical directory of every human being in the United States.
No, not at all. It is essentially a closed loop.
It contains the DNA profiles of millions of people, but those people are exclusively convicted offenders, arrestees, and unidentified human remains.
Right. If a perpetrator has never been convicted of a qualifying felony that mandates a DNA swab, their genetic code is just not in CODIS.
So the Golden State Killer had somehow managed to avoid ever having his DNA entered into the penal system. He was a ghost in the machine.
And because of that, the case went entirely cold again for years. The traditional avenues of investigation were just completely exhausted.
Until the 2010s, when true crime writer Michelle McNamara essentially rebranded him as the Golden State Killer and brought the case back into the national consciousness with her obsessive, detailed research.
And her work attracted the attention of a veteran cold case investigator named Paul Holes from Contra Costa County.
Who had been obsessively reviewing these case files since 1994, right?
Yes, he had the DNA profile, and he was desperate to put a name to it before he retired, which forces a huge technological pivot in 2017.
Right. Paul Holes reaches out to a 76-year-old patent attorney and genetic genealogist named Barbara Rae-Venter.
And at the time, she wasn't hunting serial killers. She had been using her highly specialized skills to help adoptees find their biological parents.
By analyzing their commercial DNA test results and building out their family trees?
Exactly. So Paul Holes essentially presents her with an unprecedented proposition. He asks, can we take the methods you use to reunite families and weaponize them to build a family tree for a serial killer?
And she accepted the challenge. So investigators took the killer's DNA, which was extracted from an old 1980s rape kit, and they uploaded it to GEDmatch.
Which is a public, open-source genealogy site where regular people upload their raw DNA data from companies like 23andMe or Ancestry just to find lost relatives.
And 63 days after that upload, Barbara Rae-Venter was staring at her computer screen in the middle of the night, realizing she was looking at the true identity of the Golden State Killer.
The manual labor involved in those 63 days is just staggering to think about.
Yeah, she didn't just type his DNA into a computer and get a name pop out.
No, she identified distant relatives on GEDmatch. We're talking third, fourth, and fifth cousins who shared just a tiny fraction of DNA with the killer.
And from those distant cousins, she used traditional, painstakingly slow genealogical records.
We are talking about scrolling through digitized 19th century census data, reading old newspaper obituaries, tracking down marriage licenses, all to build a massive family tree backward in time.
Just to find the common ancestors that the killer and these distant cousins shared back in the early 1800s.
Right. And once she found those common ancestors from the 1800s, the process flipped. She had to build the family tree forward in time, tracing every single descendant of those ancestors down to the present day.
She was looking for a very specific needle in a very large biological haystack. The suspect had to be a male of a certain age with ties to the very specific geographic locations in California where the crimes occurred.
And that constructed family tree contained over 1,000 different people.
Wow, over 1,000. And they eliminated those branches of the tree one by one, cross-referencing ages, locations, life events, until only a single name remained viable.
Joseph James DeAngelo. A 72-year-old former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, California.
But a family tree isn't enough to make an arrest, right? They needed physical proof.
Exactly. So Paul Holes and the task force set up a covert stakeout of DeAngelo's house. They waited for him to go to a store, and they covertly swabbed the door handle of his car while he was inside.
And later, they collected a tissue he threw away in his curbside trash. They rushed those items to a lab, extracted the DNA, and compared it to the 1980s crime scenes.
And it was a 100% match.
Unbelievable.
What's fascinating here is the sheer paradigm shift this represented for forensic science. As we established, traditional CODIS testing requires the suspect to already be in a police database.
But investigative genetic genealogy completely bypasses that limitation.
Entirely. It compares crime scene DNA against completely innocent citizens who have never committed a crime, but who are simply looking for their ancestors.
It relies entirely on the voluntary, innocent participation of the general public in these commercial databases to build a net around the suspect.
Yeah.
To put this into a visual framework, traditional DNA testing through CODIS is like a detective looking for a very specific, rare book, but they only have access to a highly restricted, locked library.
Right. If the book isn't on the shelf in that specific library, the search is over. You're out of luck.
Exactly. But investigative genetic genealogy, it's like using Google to search the entire global internet. The scope of available data expands from a few million convicted felons to potentially hundreds of millions of connected citizens.
It's a massive shift in scope.
But bringing this back to the mechanics, if DeAngelo never personally bought a 23andMe kit and never submitted his own DNA to these websites, how do we actually go from a drop of decades-old crime scene blood to a third cousin and then to a specific suspect's doorstep?
Like, how does the biology actually translate into a name?
Yeah, exactly.
That procedural gap is where the true science of IgG comes into play. To comprehend how investigators make that leap, we have to look at the fundamental biological difference between the DNA testing police have relied on for decades and the consumer DNA testing you buy online for $100.
Okay.
They're looking at entirely different parts of the human genome.
Let's break down that biology, because traditional forensic DNA typing, the kind used for CODIS, analyzes something called STR markers, right? Short tandem repeats.
Yes.
And from my understanding of the sources, this is a very narrow, highly targeted look at the genome. They're only looking at 13 to 20 specific genetic locations.
Right, and that narrow focus was largely a product of the computing power and scientific limitations of the 1990s when CODIS was developed.
That makes sense.
SDR analysis looks for short sequences of DNA that repeat themselves. By measuring the length of these repeating segments at 20 specific locations, you get a highly precise, unique barcode for an individual.
So it is phenomenal for one-to-one matching. Like, if you have a suspect in custody and you want to know if his blood is on the murder weapon, STR testing will give you a mathematical certainty.
Exactly.
It's basically like checking a license plate. If a car runs a red light and a camera captures the license plate, you can look up exactly who owns that car.
That's a great analogy.
But that license plate tells you absolutely nothing about the car itself. It doesn't tell you the make, the model, the color, or where the parts were manufactured. And if you only have half the license plate, or if the car isn't registered in your database,
then the STR method is useless.
Right.
Taking that analogy a step further, consumer DNA tests don't look at the license plate. They look at the manufacturing blueprints down to the individual bolts.
Wow.
Consumer tests use a technology called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms.
SNPs.
Right. Instead of looking at 20 isolated markers, SNP profiling examines hundreds of thousands of genetic variations scattered across the entirety of the human genome.
Hundreds of thousands of markers versus 20.
Exactly. A SNP represents a difference in a single DNA building block called a nucleotide.
The sheer volume of data being extracted from a single sample is an astronomical upgrade.
And that volume is what makes genealogy possible. Because SNPs cover so much of the genome in such dense detail, scientists can identify large, continuous blocks of identical DNA shared between two different people.
Okay, so when two people share a large block of identical SNPs,
It means they inherited that exact sequence from a recent common ancestor. And the larger the shared block of SNPs, the closer the familial relationship. You simply cannot see those inherited blocks using the old 20-marker STR method.
so step one of the IgG process is taking that old, degraded crime scene DNA and taking it to a specialized private lab to get a high-tech, massive SNP profile generated.
Yes.
What happens in step two? How does that biological blueprint get into the online system?
Step 2 is the digitization and database upload. The specialized laboratory takes all the data from those hundreds of thousands of SNPs and converts it into a raw data file.
What does that look like?
To a human, this file is completely incomprehensible. It is essentially a massive plain text computer file filled with millions of letters A, C, T, and G representing the genetic sequence.
Okay.
Law enforcement takes that raw text file and creates a seemingly normal user account on a consumer database that permits law enforcement searches like GEDmatch or family tree DNA.
And they just upload it?
Yep, they upload the file, and the website's system assigns it a unique identifier known as a KIT number.
So once that KIT number is generated, step 3 is where the human steps back and the algorithm takes over.
Exactly. The website's algorithm performs what is called a one-to-many comparison. It takes the suspect's KIT number and rapidly cross-references those hundreds of thousands of SNPs against every single other user in the massive database.
It's hunting for those shared blocks of DNA we discussed.
Right. And when it finds a match, it measures the length of those shared segments using a very specific unit of genetic measurement called centimorgans.
Centimorgans. That specific word appears constantly in the TIAC law firm brief and the Harvard Law Review source. What exactly is a centimorgan measuring in a physical sense?
Well, a centimorgan is not a measure of physical distance like an inch or a millimeter. It is a measure of genetic probability.
Oh, interesting.
Specifically, it measures the probability of genetic recombination. When human beings produce sperm or egg cells, their DNA recombines, it shuffles the deck of genetic traits. A centimorgan measures how likely it is that a specific block of DNA will be inherited intact without being broken apart during that shuffling process.
So if a block of DNA is huge, meaning it has a high number of centimorgans, it means it hasn't gone through very many generations of shuffling.
Exactly the concept. The rule of thumb in genetic genealogy is entirely based on that probability. The higher the number of shared centimorgans, the closer the relative.
Give me some numbers for context.
Sure. Parent and child will share a massive amount of centimorgans, usually around 300 to 400. A first cousin will share around 800. A third cousin might only share 50 or 70 centimorgans.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the GEmatch algorithm finishes its search and provides the investigator with a list of user profiles, ranked strictly by the total number of shared centimorgans.
Which brings us to step 4, building the tree. This is where the computer's job ends and the agonizing manual labor of the genealogist begins.
Very manual. They look at that ranked list of matches. Let's say the closest match they get is a third cousin who shares 70 centimorgans with the unknown killer.
The genealogist has to figure out who that third cousin is in real life.
Right. They look at the username, they search for an email address attached to the profile, and they start digging into public records to figure out who that cousin's great-great-grandparents were.
And that set of great-great-grandparents is the common ancestor. Then, as Barbara Rae-Venter did, they build the family tree forward in time.
The sources emphasize that the DNA is really only a compass. It points the genealogist in the right direction, but traditional investigative sleuthing does the actual walking.
Because genealogists are pulling birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds, high school yearbooks.
And interestingly, Rae-Venter explicitly noted in the sources that her most powerful tool for building the present-day branches of these trees is actually Facebook.
Wait, really? Facebook?
Yeah. People voluntarily list their siblings, aunts, uncles, and maiden names on social media. She has constructed entire intricate branches of suspect family trees simply by looking at who comments on whose vacation photos.
It's astounding how much of our family structure we broadcast publicly. And, the sources outlined several incredible high-profile examples beyond the Golden State Killer, where this exact methodology cracked impossible cases.
Like the Denise Bowden case.
Yes. Denise and her infant daughter vanished without a trace in 1981. Years later, a little girl named Lisa was abandoned. Authorities had no idea who Lisa was.
Right.
Eventually, genealogists used Lisa's DNA, uploaded it, found cousins, and used Facebook and census records to build out her family tree. They finally figured out Lisa was actually Denise Bowden's missing daughter.
And that revelation unraveled a massive thread, leading investigators to realize that the man who had abandoned Lisa was actually Terry Rasmussen.
A notorious serial killer known as the Chameleon Killer. It's just incredible.
Another remarkable application of this method detailed in the sources is the Dennis Gribble case in Ohio.
Oh, this one is fascinating.
Investigators were trying to solve a brutal cold case rape from 1997. The original rape kit evidence had been almost entirely consumed by older, less efficient testing methods over the decades.
Right.
They found an original testing tube in the back of the crime lab with just a minuscule trace of leftover biological material, We are talking about 9 nanograms of DNA.
9 nanograms. Let's ground that in reality, because that number sounds infinitesimally small. What does 9 nanograms actually look like?
Well, a single human cell contains about 6 picograms of DNA. 9 nanograms is the equivalent of roughly 1,500 human cells.
Wow.
You shed far more than that just by rubbing your eye.
Yeah.
It's practically microscopic. But with modern sequencing technology, it was enough to generate a partial SNP profile.
And Barbara Rae-Venter took that tiny degraded sample, ran it through the IgG process, came up with a list of distant matches, built the trees, and narrowed it down to a list of brothers.
Yep. Investigators surveilled the brothers, collected fresh DNA, and Dennis Gribble was arrested on his doorstep.
The efficiency of this method is frankly terrifying when you start looking at the math, which leads to a crucial question.
Go ahead.
If I personally have never purchased a 23andMe kit, and I have never uploaded my raw data to GEDmatch, but a few of my distant cousins have.
Yeah.
Am I already in the system? Is my biological blueprint already cataloged without my consent?
The statistical probability dictates that almost certainly yes, you are.
Man.
Because human beings reproduce exponentially. Everyone, on average, has nearly 200 third cousins. You likely have around 950 fourth cousins and upwards of 4,700 fifth cousins.
That is a lot of cousins.
If you go back just a few generations, the familial branches overlap so heavily that we are all interconnected. Therefore, it only takes a tiny fractional percentage of the population to take a consumer DNA test for the entire population to become genetically identifiable.
So if a genealogist can locate just 2 or 3 distinct, distant cousins of an unidentified suspect in a database, they can triangulate the common ancestors and almost always track down the source of that DNA.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? If anyone listening to this right now can be tracked and identified by law enforcement through their third cousin's innocent DNA kit, where does that leave our constitutional privacy?
Yeah, we're moving from the science into the legal battleground here.
We are talking specifically about the Fourth Amendment, the constitutional right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures.
This raises an important question, and it is the exact question that legal scholars, civil liberties advocates, and criminal defense attorneys are intensely grappling with as we speak.
Right.
Because your relatives can voluntarily submit their DNA to these companies, your own genetic privacy is no longer under your control. Your biological anonymity is essentially held in the hands of your extended family.
You cannot control what your third cousin does with their spit, but their spit can be used to establish probable cause to search you.
Precisely.
To understand how defense attorneys are fighting this, we need to look at the legal framework that allows police to operate this way in the first place.
Right.
According to the TIAC law firm source, which looks at this from a strict criminal defense perspective, the entire foundation of IgG relies on a deeply established yet highly controversial legal concept called the abandoned DNA loophole.
The jurisprudence around abandoned property has a long history. The Supreme Court has consistently held, most notably in cases like California v. Greenwood from 1988, that citizens have no reasonable expectation of privacy and property they have voluntarily abandoned.
In the Greenwood case, it was about garbage, right?
Yes. If you bag up your trash and put it on the public curb for collection, you have relinquished your claim to it. The police do not need a warrant to rip open your garbage bags and search through your refuse to find evidence of a crime.
Because the court's logic is that anyone, a scavenger, an animal, or the garbage collector, could access it, so you can't claim it's private.
The legal reasoning is that you knowingly exposed it to the public. But applying that logic to DNA creates a profound friction.
Yeah, we don't consciously throw away our DNA the way we throw away a garbage bag.
Exactly. Human biology forces us to abandon our property constantly. In the time it takes to have a conversation, you shed thousands of skin cells. You leave a carbon copy of your most intimate biological information on a restaurant fork, on a discarded napkin, on the ring of a water glass.
So law enforcement leverages this voluntarily abandoned legal precedent to bridge the gap. They use the genealogy site to get the name, but they can't arrest you just based on a family tree.
Right, they need confirmation.
So they physically tail the suspect, just like they did with DeAngelo's car door handle and his tissue. They wait for the suspect to discard an item in public, and they collect it without a warrant.
And then they extract the DNA from the coffee cup, run a traditional STR test, compare it to the crime scene, and suddenly they have an official legal match.
The collection of the abandoned coffee cup is technically legal under current precedent. The controversy and the area where defense attorneys are focusing their fire is about how the police get the suspect's name to follow them in the first place.
The focus is entirely on the initial search of the commercial databases and the massive terms of service violations that have occurred.
Right. When the news of the Golden State Killer's capture broke, millions of people who used GEDmatch suddenly had a collective realization. Wait, the police are looking at my DNA.
The public backlash was immense.
In 2019, GEDmatch was forced to completely overhaul its privacy policy. They switched their entire database to an opt-in model for law enforcement matching.
This meant that, by default, police could no longer see your DNA profile when they ran a search, unless you specifically logged into your account and clicked a button explicitly granting law enforcement permission to use your profile.
That single policy change drastically reduced the utility of the database overnight. Law enforcement suddenly lost access to millions of profiles.
Interestingly, Family Tree DNA, another major consumer site, took the opposite approach. They opted everyone in to law enforcement matching by default, forcing users to navigate their settings and manually opt out if they wanted privacy.
Wow. But the TIAC law firm brief highlights a terrifying procedural workaround that rogue investigators have used when faced with these restrictions. It is a concept called parallel construction.
Parallel construction, yes.
Looking at the TIAC law firm brief, this concept of parallel construction legitimately terrifies defense attorneys. If I'm understanding this correctly, it's basically legal money laundering, but for criminal evidence.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The police use an illegal or improper method to find a suspect, but they know a judge will throw that evidence out. So they build a totally separate, seemingly clean trail of evidence to present in court, entirely hiding the original dirty method they used to find the guy in the first place.
That is the exact mechanism of parallel construction. It is designed to circumvent the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, which states that if the source of the evidence is tainted by an illegal search, everything gained from it is also tainted and inadmissible.
Okay, let's look at how a defense attorney analyzes this playing out with a GEDmatch upload. Walk me through the procedural reality of this.
Okay. A detective has a cold case. GEDmatch's rules say the detective can only search the DNA against users who have explicitly opted into police searches. But the detective is frustrated. They want access to the whole database.
So the detective intentionally bypasses the rule.
Exactly. They take the crime scene DNA profile, they log into GEDmatch, and instead of identifying themselves as law enforcement, they check the box claiming to be a regular citizen just looking for their biological family.
They create a fake profile.
By actively violating the terms of service, the detective tricks the algorithm and suddenly gains unauthorized access to search the entire database.
Completely bypassing the privacy settings of millions of users who never consented to a police search.
Right. They run the illegal search, they find the distant cousins, they build the family tree, and they successfully identify the suspect.
And then, to hide their tracks, they delete the fake account. They wipe the digital footprint of the unauthorized search from the genealogy website.
Having identified the suspect through a clear violation of user privacy, the detective then pivots to the clean path. They physically stake out the suspect they just illegally identified.
They wait for the suspect to throw away a coffee cup.
They collect the abandoned DNA without a warrant, test it, and get a match to the crime scene.
And here's the truly insidious part for a defense lawyer. When that detective sits down at their desk to write the official arrest report, the narrative begins with the coffee cup. The report says, acting on an investigative lead, officers observed the suspect discard a beverage container. They never document the fake GEDmatch profile.
They never mention the unauthorized, warrantless genetic search of millions of innocent people that led them to the suspect's house in the first place.
From a procedural standpoint, this paralyzes the defense attorney. The bedrock of criminal defense is the discovery process. The prosecution is legally obligated to hand over all evidence and reports regarding how the investigation was conducted.
But if the initial unauthorized GEDmatch search is deleted and deliberately omitted from the police reports, the defense counsel will never know it happened.
You cannot challenge evidence you don't know exists. You cannot file a Fourth Amendment motion to suppress an illegal search if the prosecution obscures the fact that a search ever occurred.
The vulnerability in the justice system is profound, and it is precisely because of these exact loopholes, the risk of parallel construction and the weaponization of abandoned DNA, that lawmakers at both the federal and state levels have scrambled to regulate IGG.
We are witnessing a real-time collision between rapid, unprecedented technological advancement and slow-moving jurisprudence.
And the result is a highly fragmented patchwork of laws across the country.
To really understand the legal reality, we need to compare how the federal government's approach drastically differs from the strict legislative mandates being passed by individual states.
Let's start with the federal level. In 2019, recognizing that this was becoming the Wild West, the United States Department of Justice issued an interim policy to provide some guardrails for federal agencies like the FBI.
What exactly does this DOJ policy mandate?
The DOJ interim policy is an attempt to balance the operational needs of law enforcement with public privacy concerns. First, it explicitly limits the use of IgG to unsolved violent crimes, which they specifically define as homicides and sex offenses, or attempts to identify unidentified human remains.
Okay, so a narrowed scope.
Second, it requires a chain of command. An investigator cannot simply create an account on a whim. They must formally consult with a designated laboratory official, known as a DLO, and they must get authorization from a designated prosecutor before proceeding with a genealogy search.
So it puts administrative hurdles in place. And critically, it addresses the abandoned DNA issue, right? It says they can't just arrest someone based on the genealogy tree.
Right. The DOJ explicitly mandates that IgG is solely an investigative lead generator. It forbids arresting a suspect based solely on a genealogy match. The policy requires that traditional STR DNA testing, like taking a swab from a discarded coffee cup, must be performed to scientifically confirm the identity of the suspect before an arrest warrant can be executed.
On the surface, that sounds like a reasonable compromise, but the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review completely dismantled this policy in their analysis. They pointed out some massive gaping loopholes in the federal guidelines.
The critiques from the Harvard Law Review are rigorous. The most glaring constitutional issue they highlight is that the DOJ policy does not require an investigator to obtain a search warrant from a judge to utilize these massive commercial DNA databases.
Wow.
The federal government is essentially bypassing the probable cause standard entirely, treating the search of millions of genetic profiles as a simple administrative task rather than a constitutional search.
And the Harvard source also attacks that violent crimes only rule. There is a massive exception built right into the text of the policy.
Yes, there is a significant caveat. The DOJ policy allows prosecutors to authorize IgG for nonviolent crimes if they determine there is a substantial and ongoing threat to public safety or national security.
The Harvard authors argue that this language is dangerously vague. It leaves an immense amount of room for prosecutorial discretion. Who defines an ongoing threat? Could a serial burglar be considered an ongoing threat? Could a cybercriminal?
The fear is that this vague language will inevitably lead to scope creep, where IgG is used for increasingly minor offenses.
Furthermore, the Harvard analysis highlights a major flaw in how the DOJ handles user consent on these websites. The DOJ policy only requires that the genealogy sites provide explicit notice to their users that law enforcement might be accessing the database.
The legal distinction between explicit notice and informed consent is massive.
Because explicit notice just means the website has to put a paragraph buried in their terms of service or send an automated email stating their policies have changed.
Exactly. It does not require an opt-in model where the user actively reads the policy and clicks a button granting permission.
The Harvard Law Review argues that an email alerting you to a privacy policy update, an email that 99% of people will instantly delete as spam, is a completely inadequate legal mechanism to waive your fundamental right to genetic privacy.
The federal guidelines are basically treating these genealogy sites like a public park. If you decide to walk into the park, the police are allowed to look at you, and they don't need a warrant to do it.
But individual states are looking at this exact same technology and coming to a radically different conclusion. They are treating consumer DNA databases more like highly sensitive medical records that require strict, uncompromising judicial oversight.
Let's talk about Maryland, because their law, House Bill 240, is considered the gold standard for genetic privacy right now.
Maryland took a fundamentally different philosophical approach to the Fourth Amendment. Under HB 240, which went into effect in 2021, law enforcement cannot simply consult a prosecutor and log on to a website.
No, they must submit an affidavit to a judge demonstrating probable cause and obtain judicial authorization before they can even begin an IgG search.
That immediately strips away the prosecutorial discretion that the DOJ allows and puts a neutral judge back into the equation. But Maryland also specifically attacked the parallel construction and the coffee cup loopholes.
They systematically dismantled the workarounds. Under the Maryland law, covertly collected DNA, like the discarded coffee cup from a suspect, can only be subjected to a traditional, narrow STR test to see if it matches the original crime scene.
So law enforcement is legally forbidden from taking that coffee cup and running a massive SNP test on it to learn about the suspect's health markers or ancestry.
Right. Even more critically, if the DNA on that coffee cup does not match the crime scene, the state is forbidden from uploading that innocent person's DNA to any local, state, or federal database. The biological material must be destroyed.
They are actively blocking the state from building a shadow database of innocent people who just happen to be suspects for a day.
Yes.
And what about collecting DNA from third parties? Let's say the police figure out my cousin might be distantly related to the killer, and they want my cousin's DNA to help narrow down the branches of the family tree. Under the federal rules, could they just follow my cousin and steal his coffee cup?
Under federal guidelines, relying on the abandoned property doctrine, they theoretically could. But Maryland HB 240 strictly prohibits that. Investigators in Maryland must approach that third-party non-suspect, explain the situation, and obtain written, informed consent before collecting their DNA.
They cannot covertly follow an innocent relative and snatch their garbage to build a family tree.
Furthermore, to prevent the leakage of genetic data, the genealogists working on the case are legally forbidden from retaining any records, trees, or materials pertaining to the investigation once the case concludes.
Maryland isn't the only state drawing hard lines in the sand. Montana passed House Bill 602, which cuts right through the administrative red tape and gets straight to the constitutional core.
Montana's legislation is elegantly straightforward. It states that law enforcement must obtain a criminal search warrant issued by a judge and based on established probable cause to obtain any search results from a consumer DNA database.
The only exception is if the consumer has previously explicitly waived their right to privacy. No warrant, no genealogy search. It explicitly binds genetic data to the strict protections of the Fourth Amendment.
But this creates a massive jurisdictional headache.
Let's look at a very real hypothetical situation based on these conflicting sources. If a state like Maryland requires a judge's authorization and strict adherence to informed consent, and Montana requires a hard search warrant, but the federal DOJ policy doesn't require a warrant at all. What happens when a federal FBI agent and a local Maryland homicide detective are working together on a joint federal-state task force to solve a serial murder, whose rules govern the investigation?
That jurisdictional friction is the exact battleground legal scholars are warning about. Currently, federal agencies operate under the DOJ guidelines, which offer broad access, while state agencies must adhere to their strict state laws.
In a joint task force scenario, the strictest applicable law generally governs the conduct of the state officers.
But the interplay between federal data access and state evidentiary rules is incredibly muddy. If a federal FBI agent obtains a genealogy lead from GEDmatch without a warrant and hands that lead to a Maryland detective who then makes the arrest, can the Maryland prosecutor use the resulting evidence in a state court, or is it tainted by the federal agent's lack of a warrant?
Criminal defense attorneys are aggressively gearing up to litigate these exact jurisdictional gray areas. The legal landscape is highly unstable.
We have spent the bulk of this hour focusing heavily on how this technology is a massive, somewhat intimidating weapon for the prosecution to hunt down criminals. But to fully understand the scope of IGG, we have to flip the coin.
We have to look at how this exact same tool is being utilized by the defense.
The conversation regarding IGG is often framed exclusively around law enforcement overreach. But the reality is that the very same biological tracking technology that can track down a killer can also be used to find the objective truth when the state has put the wrong person behind bars. It is a dual-use technology.
Let's look back at that strict Maryland law, HB 240. The lawmakers didn't just restrict police, they explicitly built a pathway for post-conviction relief.
Under the Maryland law, a defendant who has been convicted of a violent crime can formally file an affidavit with the court requesting the use of genetic genealogy on the old case evidence, provided it has the scientific potential to produce exculpatory evidence.
The inclusion of post-conviction access is monumental for the justice system. The statistics provided by the Innocence Project in our sources highlight the grim reality of wrongful convictions. Between 1989 and 2020, there were 375 documented exonerations in the United States based on DNA evidence.
Out of those 375 innocent people, 21 of them were actively sitting on death row waiting to be executed.
21 innocent lives saved from state execution purely because of biological data. But traditional STR DNA testing can only go so far in a post-conviction scenario.
Traditional STR testing is limited. If an innocent man is sitting in prison for a rape he didn't commit, traditional DNA testing can analyze the old rape kit and prove that the DNA does not belong to the man in prison. That is enough to exonerate him.
But investigative genetic genealogy can do something far more powerful for the victims and the community.
It doesn't just say this man is innocent. By taking that same DNA, uploading it to GEDmatch, and building the family tree, IgG can actually find the specific person who did commit the crime.
Genetic genealogists are now actively partnering with post-conviction innocence clinics, exploring how to use these databases to find the actual perpetrators, hold the true criminals accountable, and finally free the wrongfully imprisoned.
It has the power to correct the ultimate failures of the justice system.
But even with its incredible power to exonerate the innocent and catch the guilty, we have to ground ourselves in the reality that IgG is an evolving science, and it is not infallible.
The sources detail a deeply concerning cautionary tale that occurred right in the middle of the Golden State Killer investigation itself. It's an incident known as the Oregon misfire.
The Oregon misfire is a critical case study in the dangers of biological tunnel vision. In early 2017, long before they found Joseph James DeAngelo, investigators were desperately analyzing the killer's DNA profile.
They identified a very specific rare genetic marker in the killer's code. They found a user in a commercial database who shared that rare marker, and they traced that user's family tree.
That specific branch of the tree led them straight to a 73-year-old man who was living in a nursing home rehabilitation facility in Oregon City.
An elderly man who had absolutely nothing to do with the California murders.
Completely innocent. He had never been a suspect. But based entirely on that rare genetic lead, an Oregon police officer went to a judge, obtained a court order, walked into the rehabilitation facility, and forcibly collected a DNA sample from this elderly man who was recovering from an illness.
The subsequent laboratory testing proved definitively that he was not the killer. The genetic marker was simply a coincidence, a shared trait from a distant ancestor that did not translate to criminal guilt.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Oregon misfire is the ultimate proof that investigative genetic genealogy can point the finger of the state at the completely wrong person if the genetic data isn't verified meticulously by traditional, rigorous police work.
It perfectly illustrates why the DOJ and states like Maryland require traditional STR confirmation before an arrest. IgG is an incredibly powerful, revolutionary tool. It is the ultimate lead generator. But it's fundamentally just that, a lead generator.
It is a compass. It is not a magical truth machine that prints out the name of a guilty person.
It requires painstaking, old-fashioned detective work verifying alibis, checking employment records, establishing physical timelines, to bridge the immense gap between a genetic match on a computer screen and a legitimate constitutional arrest.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. From the brilliant, unorthodox methods Paul Holes and Barbara Rae-Venter used to finally unmask the Golden State Killer after 4 decades, to the incredibly complex biological science of replacing STR markers with hundreds of thousands of SNPs to measure centimorgans.
We've navigated the tense legal battlegrounds where criminal defense attorneys are desperately fighting against the shadows of parallel construction, and we've analyzed how state legislatures in Maryland and Montana are attempting to codify genetic privacy to protect citizens against federal overreach.
And we have seen how this unprecedented biological dragnet holds the profound dual potential to both incarcerate the most elusive, guilty predators and exonerate the most tragic, innocent victims of our justice system.
It's a lot to think about.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The reason this complex web of science and constitutional law matters so deeply to you, the listener, is that every single time you or a family member spits into a plastic tube to find out where your ancestors migrated from or to see if you have a genetic marker for a specific health condition, you are actively participating in the largest crowdsourced forensic database in human history.
You are voluntarily adding a brick to the wall of a biological dragnet.
As these commercial DNA databases continue to grow exponentially year after year, we are rapidly approaching a mathematical tipping point.
Soon, it simply won't matter if you actively choose to opt in, manually opt out, or explicitly refuse to ever purchase a consumer DNA kit in your life. If enough of your distant cousins participate in this biological mapping, your entire genetic identity will be searchable by default, whether you consent to it or not.
When that inevitable day comes, does the concept of genetic privacy even exist anymore? Or will we simply have to completely redefine what the Fourth Amendment means in the biological age?
Because the next time you throw away a coffee cup on the street, you might be leaving behind a lot more than just a little leftover caffeine you're leaving behind a map to your entire family.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
This presentation has been from me, Brandon, and co-presenter Ava. If this is the kind of storytelling you're looking for, consider subscribing to Enter the Crime. Global true crime told like a documentary.